All right, welcome to podcast 4 in our evolution series. We are continuing to look at the evidence that evolution has occurred on planet Earth, that species have changed over time. And in this segment, we're going to look specifically at the fossil record as a body of evidence. Last time we looked at biogeography. Remember, none of these is taken individually of itself, but we're pulling from all these different areas together. They give us this massive body of evidence that evolution has actually occurred. Okay? Again, evidence, 5 major areas. We are looking in this podcast at the fossil record. Okay? Now, fossils, as you know, are bits of evidence of living things preserved in rock, whether they are bone or actual creatures preserved in amber, or impressions of organisms, like these impressions of leaves left in rock. Any of those things counts as a fossil. So what is the fossil record then? Just a record of organisms preserved in rock. And what it shows is that today's organisms that we have on the planet have descended from ancestral species. For example, the fossil record shows us that our elephants that exist today are linked back in time to other ancestors that eventually gave rise to elephants. Okay, so let's talk about that fossil record and briefly how it formed. Sedimentary rock is our best source of fossils. Sedimentary rock, of course, gets laid down underneath an ocean or a sea in a body of water. As sediment washes off the land into the ocean, the sediment sinks and creates layers upon layers upon layers of sand, silt, mud that eventually harden over time to create sedimentary rock. Okay? Organisms that die and drop down and their bodies lay in the sediment as it's being laid down eventually get buried, and their imprints, like these trilobites, which were once the dominant life form on planet Earth and have all gone extinct, their bodies would be preserved in these sediments. And if we find these sedimentary rocks later on today, we can break apart the sediments and often find fossils or imprints of these organisms to show that they once did in fact exist, and this is where they died. Okay. Additionally, we know that the rocks that are at the bottom of the sedimentary layers, like this sediment at the bottom, nearer the bottom of the Grand Canyon, would be older than the layers that are at the top. Okay, these would have gotten laid down first, down below, and the top ones would have been laid down later, thus suggesting that organisms down in this area would be more ancient, older than the ones at the top. Okay, the fossil record has very clearly shown us evolutionary change in horses. We have the fossil record that shows very clearly the evolution of horses from small, maybe medium dog-sized creatures that would have inhabited a kind of a woodland habitat, and they had toes and certain types of teeth. The fossil record very clearly shows us the evolution of these to our single-toed, very large horses that are alive today. So what hypotheses should we be able to make about the fossil record and what it should show us? If evolution has not occurred, then there should be no real pattern to the fossil record. There should be no real pattern to what we find in the rocks. We should be able to find pretty much anything in any layer. Okay? No pattern. If all organisms appeared on Earth at one time, fully formed. Okay? Now, the alternate hypothesis, if evolution has occurred, then we would expect first life forms to be more simple and to be found in the most ancient layers of the rocks. And if evolution has occurred, we would expect not always to find the same life forms as we move up into more recent rock layers. We would expect those life forms to change over time, reflecting evolutionary change, and perhaps even becoming more complex. Okay, so what does that fossil record actually show us? Okay, indeed, the fossil record unequivocally shows us that at the beginning there were fewer species, and the species that existed in our most ancient times, as illustrated in our most ancient layers of rocks, were more simple. They were, in fact, prokaryotic, our very first life forms on Earth, as indicated in the rock layers. Okay? And as we come up into more recent rock layers, we see this difference, increasing numbers of different species and increasing in complexity in more recent rocks. And instead of just being single-celled organisms, they become multicellular and more complex as you come into more recent, more modern rocks. So this succession that we see in the fossil record, this increase in complexity and increase in different kinds of living things, is in agreement with other evidence we have for evolution, specifically the biochemical evidence of related genetics, and all the other cell biology that tells us that prokaryotes are the ancestors for all living things alive today. Prokaryotes were the first, bacteria were the first. And this means that prokaryotes should precede eukaryotes in the fossil record, and indeed they do. The fossil record is absolutely unequivocal about that. Prokaryotes come first, okay? The oldest known fossils are prokaryotes, and they arise at around 3.8, 3.9 billion years ago, remembering that our Earth is around 4.6 billion years old. Okay, but let's talk about organisms we can more readily relate to. Vertebrates, animals with backbones. Okay, classic fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, vertebrates. If all species had been created individually at the same time, then all the vertebrate classes, all the things we think of as animals, and when we think of animals in the world, the vertebrates, would make their first appearance in the fossil record in rocks of all about the same age, and they would all appear at once. This is not what is observed, okay? What is observed is the chronological appearance of the different classes of vertebrate animals in the fossil record. They appear at different times, okay? The fish appear first. Fishes, remember, and just so you know, fishes, that's what you use when you're talking about many different species of fish. Fishes predate all other vertebrates. Next in the fossil record, after the fish, we see amphibians arise. We see reptiles after them, and then after the reptiles, we finally see mammals and birds arise, kind of not too far apart from each other. So this is consistent with the history of vertebrate evolution as revealed by many other kinds of evidence. Again, the anatomy of vertebrates, their body structures, the genetics that we observe in vertebrates. This is in alignment with all of those other types of evidence. So here is a wonderful phylogeny showing a general, if the ancient common ancestor to all vertebrates is somewhere back here, what we see is the fish, the jawless fish, and then the sharks and the bony fish. These guys all arise first. And then after that, we see amphibians. After amphibians, we see reptiles. And after reptiles, we see birds and mammals branching off from reptile lineage. Okay, so one thing that the Darwinian view of this fossil record predicts is that transitional forms should appear in the fossil record, meaning organisms that are not quite but not quite reptile, something in between, should it appear in the time period between reptiles and when birds first appear. Okay, there should be transition organisms to represent them. So a transitional form, a transitional fossil, is a fossil that links older fossils to more modern species. It's something in between. Okay. One example, we have a whole series of skulls, okay, that show us very clearly the change from reptile that some branch of reptiles made, obviously not all of them because we still have reptiles, but some branch of reptiles made to become eventually mammals, okay? That's one example, okay? Let's look at the big example, the huge example. All vertebrates, according to the fossil record, arose from, and other evidence arose from fish. Okay, if that is true, then we should be able to find some transitional organism that is sort of fishy, but also sort of amphibian-like. It should be sort of quasi getting adapted to land movement and things like that. The transitional form for this was elusive, but its existence was predicted by Darwin, by researchers, and they went and looked for it. They looked for it. They felt like what it should look like was largely like a fish. There should still be fins, but that there should be structures that made it somewhat more amphibian-like. Okay? And in 2006, they found it. If they had someone design this organism, it could not have more perfectly matched what people thought it should look like. Okay, it was called Tiktaalik rosier, and it is the missing link, so to speak, from sea true fish to land animals. This is obviously an artist's depiction of what it might have actually looked like. This is a cast of the actual fossil that they found. Okay, and while we see it as clearly fishy, the skin is scaly. There are no digits that are visible. This fin is present, but obviously look at what it's doing with its front limbs. It is using them to support weight, and the limb is where all the action is with this animal and how it is linked to all the tetrapods, the land vertebrates that came after it. So it has both fish characteristics and tetrapod characteristics, and we want to most specifically focus on the limb structure. If you look at this diagram here, in the ancestral fish that the Tiktaalik would have come from, we see mostly a fin, mostly a fishy fin. There's some bones up in the upper proximal near the body part of the fin, but mostly fin. What we see here are lots more bony structures that are going to allow this fin to act much more like a supportive weight-bearing structure than this fin ever could. And then finally, what we see in the first amphibians is these bones becoming truly limb bones and very much like with the bones in place that would give rise to all the vertebrate bones that we associate with tetrapods today. Okay. Bird evolution, another great example of finding a transitional form. Okay. If ideas about vertebrate evolution are correct, then we should be able to find a transitional form that not only links mammals to reptiles, but also links birds and reptiles. Okay. Darwinian evolution predicts that transitional form. Do such fossils exist? Yes, they do. Yes, they do. Okay. Darwinian evolution predicts that a transitional form between true reptiles and true birds would have some reptilian characteristics and some avian or bird characteristics. Okay. And just fitting that bill perfectly was Archaeopteryx, a fossil that was found, an imprint of this animal was found in between sedimentary rock layers. And it is an almost perfect transitional form, much like Tiktaalik was for fish to land vertebrates. It has feathers. The imprints of the feathers were plainly visible in the rock layers, and I'll show you the fossil in just a second. And clearly are avian. Feathers are unique to birds. However, it had a heavy skull with full teeth, which we do not see in modern birds. It had claws on its wingtips. Look at these digits on its wingtips. Obviously, we don't see that anymore in modern birds. It had a long tail that had a vertebral column in it. We don't see that in birds anymore. That's a reptilian characteristic. However, its skull structure, the structure of its skull and what brain parts would have gone into those structures indicate that it had a brain that was structured much like a bird's brain, with parts that are used in flight very, very much more enlarged, more prominent than in a normal reptile. Okay. So there is the actual fossil imprint that was found, and we can see the feathers all here and actually going down on either side. But you also see that vertebral column going down the tail. If this were a better picture, we could see the teeth, and you can certainly see the clawed digits at the wings. And this is showing the comparison between the modern bird skull and Archaeopteryx, and the similarity in the structure of the brain case and what parts of the brain would have been emphasized in that animal. Okay. Whales, another awesome set of transitional fossils showing us step by step, and it is quite detailed, not much more detailed than the transition from reptile to bird. We have almost a step-by-step account of whale evolution. So whales are mammals. They make milk. They do the things that mammals do. If evolution occurred and mammals evolved on land, which is what the fossil record and all the other evidence tells us, then if whales are mammals, they must once have been land mammals and then secondarily evolved back to water. Is there fossil evidence to support this? This is just the essence of how science works here. You ask a question. If this is the set of facts we accept is true, then we should be able to find this thing. Can we find it? And if the answer is no, you come back and you toss out something in this hypothesis. But if it's yes, you kind of have to accept it until you find some other evidence to dispel it. So researchers have found fossilized whales and whale ancestors that link our modern aquatic mammals with their ancient land ancestors. It is pretty unequivocal, and we're going to talk more about this diagram in a different podcast. But look at this, okay? So where are the transitional fossils? Here are our modern whales, okay? Our toothed whales and our I can't think of the filter feeders, okay, that eat the krill, okay? How embarrassing. What do you call that stuff? Oh, well. At any rate, baleen, thank you. Okay, and our baleen whales. What do we find, okay? What we find is an incredibly clear step-by-step fossil transition from a large dog-sized land mammal to an organism that became increasingly more adapted to water. This guy here is an artist's depiction showing, I believe, probably this step in the fossil transition, and this animal had webbed feet, would probably have lived in water but not been, maybe somewhat crocodilian in its ability to get on land and get in water and predate on things and so on. And we just slowly creep more and more into the water with every step in in the evolutionary path, and we see it clearly illustrated in the fossils we find. Okay, so that's it for the fossil record. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next podcast. Take care.